I'm going to kick off with just a couple of questions while you all sharpen your pencils and get ready to grill everyone. Fran, you've asked us to see MOG changes as something necessary and desirable, and I think, you know, obviously there's a strong case that that can be the case, and that anyway they are the legitimate exercise of the First Minister's prerogative in relation to how things are organised, and that we should make a virtue of this. Why is it that you think that in the way leadership groups across departments deploy all of their effort around business processes and systems, that there isn't built into that a kind of concept that actually bits of this are going to move around? For sins in a past life, I had responsibility for shared services in New South Wales for just a minute. And it struck me as odd that if we couldn't get a standard set of a chart of accounts across departments, that some of what you're talking about might be a holy grail.
Yeah. Look, it does feel like a holy grail. So I'm going to kind of say there's a couple of propositions. Firstly, we have public services these days that are dominated by the policy maker. You can get to very, very senior positions, indeed to secretary, as policy maker without having managed large functions. That doesn't mean that you're not a good secretary, but it does mean you've missed out on a couple of experiences that would be quite useful, that might make you think about some of those leadership things. And along the way, as governments and public services have been trimmed, although sometimes it doesn't feel like public services have been trimmed, parts that we've trimmed out have been human resource functions. When I first started working in the public service, the human resource function was one of the most powerful functions in a department, and a whole generation of leaders came out of people who had run really big human resource functions. Even finance functions have been turned into primarily transactional functions rather than strategic and big operating functions. And then, of course, there is the perennial of ICT. I have never understood why people argue so much over particular types of ICT, quite frankly. Like, you know, they're all pretty much the same. And why governments don't say to their agencies, like, get over it, we're going to have a common system. You know, there are some things you just don't waste your time arguing about. And if you know, we had a good system and similar standards, having some of those things in place would help. But we don't have lots of leaders who automatically think about the importance of that, what I'd call the functional support to delivery of good services and indeed good policy. We don't value it as much as it once was when public services used to run things. So when I first started working in the public service, the really powerful jobs were the regional jobs. They delivered services, they ran big budgets, they knew about human resource management and budgeting and financing, and well, they didn't know much about ICT in those days, but you know, they would have if there'd been ICT around in those days. So that focus has gone. And I mean, I do say, and I hold myself partly responsible, having worked in central agencies, that it is incumbent, I think, on central agencies, particularly the First Minister's Department, who is the main vehicle by which machinery of government change is often pushed. It is incumbent on them to think about these issues and to drive a case for investment in the sorts of things that would make machinery of government change easier to effect, but also argue the case about why ongoing investment in people and culture and organisation is important for the delivery of good services, and being an arguer for importance of investment in that.
Similar situation in New Zealand, or have you answered some of those questions in the way these big business processes and systems are managed?
No, we're in a very similar situation. I think in the New Zealand context, you know, the kind of drive through the vertical for many years has meant that, you know, every department's got its own ICT system, its own everything. And so then when you start thinking about joining up, I always remember when the New Zealand Employment Service and Income Support, I think it was in those days, joined together, the two IT people basically got together and said, this is the most difficult integration ever seen. It was almost like somebody designed the Employment Service ICT system on Mars, and the other one, you know, they just didn't speak the same language. It just didn't work at any level. And it is incumbent on us, I think, to be able to make those sorts of things easier. And I think particularly in the ICT world, there is a need to make that much easier. And also make it much easier for citizens to be able to engage, right?
Yep.
It often seems to me that as public servants, we like to complain about MOG changes. Even the framing of the question for this session has a sort of implicit assumption that machinery of government changes are possibly over-relied upon. And yet most of us who work in or lead agencies tend to over-rely on organisation restructures as a means of driving change within agencies. So I'm just interested in what both of you think about what we should be doing at a more general level to get away from this idea that the solution to every problem starts with organisational structure.
Well, I mean, I think if we're probably all honest, many people have reached for organisation structure or restructures as a way to not deal with particular issues, whether they be cultural or behavioural or, you know, everybody does that, right? And it's almost known, you know, I've heard lots of people talk about, oh, that restructure is only being done to deal with this particular issue. And I think we need to be more honest about what it is that we're trying to achieve, and we need to be honest about dealing with the issues that are in front of us. Look, I think MOG changes can be really powerful in terms of getting either a shift in performance or, as I talked about, disrupting the system to get better outcomes. And if they are well done, well communicated, well thought through and invested in, I think they can be hugely successful.
If you think either of, you know, organisational administrative restructuring or machinery of government changes, I have always been amused by, you know, you get a new head of organisation and the first thing they do is reach for the restructuring manual, and have been known to refer to it as they're like a dog pissing around their territory. But the truth is all structures, organisational structures, degrade over time. You know, bureaucracy is not a bad term, and being a bureaucrat is not a bad and evil thing. But one of the features of bureaucracy and large-scale bureaucracies is that they do become very settled. There's a natural conservatism to them. They become very hard form and hard to navigate, and they are different from what might be the priorities of the time. So my example of DSE, when I first started working in government, we probably had 4 organisations that, you know, dealt with issues that DSE, the Department of Sustainability and Environment, came for. But organisations do degrade. So having organisational restructures is not a bad thing. Because sometimes you do need to reshape an organisation to be more fit for purpose in a contemporary fashion. I just think the form of organisational restructure you talked about, my heart bled for your child protection organisation. I mean, they wouldn't have had time to be even focusing on dealing with the issues if they were dealing with that many restructures. And what restructures don't automatically get to is what is wrong with the function and our expectation of the function. And that's particularly the case in child protection. So I think they're a good thing to have because organisations degrade over time. But if they're not driven by purpose and improvement, so what is it we're trying to solve for, then it's moving the deck chairs around and more confusing than not.
And I think that may be part of what I struggle with in the restructuring space, whether it's at the MOG level or the department level, is often there's a sort of implicit statement that there's a perfect model out there for these functions and we haven't got it, but the new structure's that perfect model. And I think Fran's right, all things tend towards entropy over time. And perhaps a better narrative for people is around why a particular configuration works for a period of time and how we'll actually make a set of judgments about what changes or reconfigurations will be required down the track, rather than kind of, it seems to me we lurch from here's the perfect structure to oops, that's not quite working anymore, here's the next perfect structure. And staff, I think, really understand at a very deep level that that's the wrong story.
And structure is a very imperfect instrument for what it's trying to deal with. Our public service organisations are incredibly complicated. They deal with hard and complicated things, and almost the minute you put them in place, you will find that the new structure has bits that rub together badly and don't solve the problem. So if that's all you think is the answer, you never will get it right. But it is also dealing with the what do we do other than structure to get to the root cause of performance or new priority or whatever our overriding objective is.
One last question from me before I open it up to the floor. We've been running employee surveys in New South Wales now for a relatively short period of time, 4 years. Third survey's just completed, and we'll release the analysis from a survey, actually this time that got a very large response rate in a few weeks' time. We do know that there's a very strong view amongst public sector workers in New South Wales that change management is not perceived as a strength of public sector leaders. That's not the perception of leaders necessarily, but it's the perception of the bulk of staff. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on whether you think the success of machinery of government changes has more to do with the change management capacity of leaders than it does the institutional form of those changes, and what should we be doing to address our change management capacity?
Well, I definitely agree. It's not about the institution, and it's always about the people, right? So I'm very clear that in any machinery of government exercise, as I said before, attention needs to be paid to making sure you capture the hearts and minds of the individuals in the organisation who actually have to deliver this really hard, often hard and complex work. So, and the key aspect of change management from my perspective is about communication and making sure that you continue to communicate with the people in the organisation about why it is that you're doing what you're doing, where it is that you're going and why, what it means to be able to get there. So I think in New Zealand there would be a similar view from some parts of the system that says change management is something that we've underinvested in and that senior public leaders aren't all great at it. I would think there's some truth in that, but I think there are equally, and it needs to be bought in or whatever. I would say it's a mixed bag. I think some public sector leaders are actually very, very good at change management, but it has to be, it's relentless, right? So you have to do it and you have to keep on doing it until you're there. You just can't say it and all things will happen. So yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Being of the view that you can make almost any structure work provided you have people of good intelligence and goodwill and who are collectivised around whatever the objectives are, I would think that change management is it is an undervalued attribute of leadership. Now, I'm not saying that the leaders are incapable of change management, although I haven't seen lots of expression of it, because it requires deep attention to detail. Deep attention to detail and investment in that detail. Detailed design, detailed execution, and detailed kind of constant observation that the sort of thing that you want to have in place is actually happening. People will argue that it's hard for them to do that when they have ministers whose attention to that sort of detail is non-existent, who are entirely uninterested in how the department is run. Very few ministers these days themselves have been leaders of large organisations. I'm trying to think of one. Please, if someone knows one, please mention them, but I can't think of any. So they don't necessarily have that kind of understanding. You know, I often had ministers say to me, I don't know what you do when you're not here. It's an organisation of 15 billion people and $15 billion and 12,000 people, so there are one or two other things I do when I'm not here. But that wasn't uncommon in a view. So lots of leaders will talk as though they are not that they are working in an environment that doesn't value it and doesn't allow them. I'm not going to let people get off that easily, because as the leader of a public sector organisation, you make choices all the time about how you spend your time and how you deploy your resources. And I don't think we value it as much as we once might have. Indeed, maybe if we spend a little less time talking about leadership and a bit more about management, we might be better at change management than we currently appear to be.
So I'm going to open it up to questions, although I will respond to one observation you just made, which of course is that in New South Wales, our Premier did hold a senior position in a large corporation, and his experience in that, I think, has certainly helped my office in asserting to the sector the importance of everything you said about the HR function, because he has experienced within a large corporate just how valued the HR function is in a strategic sense in that setting, and that's been quite important.
And you're right, he would be one of the few that I have observed who thinks those kind of things matter. So
we have colleagues from ANZSOG who have mics, and if you could wait for the mic and if you could say who you are and where you're from when you ask the question.
Thanks. My name's Gavin Seymour from New South Wales, Roads and Maritime. It seems to me that the need for change has kind of driven an acceptance of change, of machinery of government. And we talked about, you mentioned, Graham, grumbling. When you see another change, and I'm talking, I suppose, at an agency level, you grumble about it, but you don't really question why it's been made and how you can do to achieve that. Hopefully this won't sound too cynical, but sometimes I think that the continual reform makes me think that if you completed a reform, you'd have to then be held accountable for actually delivering what that reform was intended to complete. And Bill English talked about a rugby league analogy before, which I'll dip into as well. It's the rebuilding stage. You tell your fans, don't worry, we're losing for the next 5 years because we're rebuilding. Debbie talked about approaches and other things. Is there a stronger role, to get to the question, is there a stronger role for maybe central government to say, not only do you have to consider other approaches before machinery government changes, you have to actually document them, cost-benefit analysis, and machinery government is at the bottom. So you have to kind of say that is the suitable thing that we need to do.
So I'll let my colleagues answer for themselves. I did have a question that was similar to yours, but and it did strike me that one of the things that's missing is proactively done work on how you could configure things differently, and the direct and indirect costs associated with doing that, so that at the point a First Minister calls his or her departmental secretary in, the head of the First Minister's department, to talk about, because most governments do not go to an election with a view of with a statement about how they're going to structure government. I do think it's the case that often the bureaucracy, in this case central agencies, haven't done the maths around the likely reconfigurations, and that could be quite helpful. I mean, I don't take the cynical view that this is about avoiding the end state. In fact, most of the MOG changes I've seen over a long period I don't think were ever capricious. They were attempting to deal with something. That doesn't mean they were always the right thing to do in order to address a particular problem. Anyone like me who lived through the, I think, 12 or 14 sets of MOG changes that affected the Environment and Natural Resource Agencies between 1990 and the mid-2000s could attest to the fact that there were issues to address, but that wasn't necessarily the best way to address them. Fran?
Fran? Look, I think I'd have to disagree. I think that I don't disagree that people should think of the consequences and be aware that there is a cost, because there is a cost. But I think reducing everything to cost benefit actually doesn't help people make decisions. And it particularly doesn't help people make decisions in government when you're not driven by a simple, does this make more money than that one? So cost benefit analysis in government has a particular use, but it doesn't necessarily help people make a decision. It will make you more aware of the costs. It's unlikely to ever particularly document the benefits. But I think in the end I'd probably say governments get elected and they get elected to govern on our behalf, and part of the idea of governance will be the structure and the arrangements around the public service, as well as the construct of stewardship, because most of those functions continue beyond a single government. But the construction of those, I think, is part of the deal of being elected. And so constraining someone with the requirement to do some public test is not necessarily something. I think their public test was their election.
Did you want to add anything, Debbie?
I agree. I think it would be good if you could have a more strategic approach to what the public services might look like from a map point of view, but actually ministers will do what ministers will do. If they ask for advice, it's great and you can give it to them, but it's on one hand, on the other hand.
Thank you.
Tēnā koutou. My name's Chris Eichbaum. I'm with Victoria University, Wellington, New Zealand. Thank you so far. Great. I guess a question to the panel, but to Debbie in the first instance. And it links in with a session earlier today. So my question is it ever appropriate to use machinery of government where, say, a Prime Minister or a Minister finds advice too free and frank or insufficiently responsive or insufficiently risk averse? And if the second part of the question is, and it goes to a point that Debbie made, if we do need to be more honest, to whom does it fall to say, with respect, Minister, that may not necessarily be the only or the best way to address your concerns?
So if I interpret your question correctly, and so you can tell me if I do or don't, but if your question goes to what is the best way to achieve outcomes, or the outcome that you're seeking, ministers, should the public service be in a position to say, well, that idea that you want to have over there is not necessarily the best idea, and we think you could get a better result if you did it slower, differently, whatever. I mean, I think that if it is in relation to MOG changes, you know, State Services Commission is the government's key advisor on that, and so I guess it is beholden on the State Services Commission to, along with central agencies, to provide that free and frank advice. But at the end of the day, ministers make calls, and you know, we're here to give effect to those calls. Does that kind of, sorry?
Do you mind if I just build on, because I think it's important to illustrate points with reality. So a few years ago, and without going into too much detail, we had exactly that situation where where the Prime Minister had a view and expressed that view about some machinery of government changes. And working with State Services Commission and a couple of other agencies, we put together an alternative proposal which he accepted, and 4 years on continues to accept. So it does happen in reality, and it is led by central agencies.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I was just going to add, I don't think I've ever seen what I would call a pure machinery of government change done around the issue of too much or insufficient. I might have seen around insufficient frank and fearless advice, but I don't think I've ever seen it around too much. And that goes to the issue of performance. I have seen machinery of government changes that are around, but it's never been around the performance of an individual. It is generally around performance of an organisation, often with very intractable problems. Mostly the issues of too much or too little frank and fearless advice get dealt with in, well, you might call them machinery of government changes, but the removal or otherwise of those people who give that advice. But I also don't really think I've ever seen anyone removed from a position for telling a minister what they thought.
Robin.
Maybe I've lived in a little bubble, but I've never seen it.
Robin Cruck from ANZSOG. A question, given that we all share governments with some instability, except the New Zealanders, Deb, and the pattern, I'd probably put in the proposition to you that it's not always within the gift of central agency or first agencies to actually determine the framework of government. Your observations on the pattern to firstly have more frequent changes of machinery of government, but also having greater disaggregation into specialist ministers. You know, if I use an example from my experience, mental health, disability and the like, has that been a benefit in driving particular reforms at certain stages of their development and implementation, or has that been potentially an impediment to the achievement of the outcomes? And I genuinely don't have the answer. It's just that I see it literally at national and at state level. More members who need to be given a spot around the cabinet table, and that seems to be an emerging trend.
I think there is, and it's an unsolved conundrum between structure of public service decisions and structure of cabinet decisions. So we do tend to have quite large cabinets regardless of size of organisation, although yours is a national government, and I don't, just because it's 4 million versus 60 million, it still has the same kind of functions. With the exception of a couple of jurisdictions in Australia where they have tiny cabinets, so one of them has 6 or 7 they counted, and they've all got about 25 portfolios. But so there is you've often got many more ministers than you have large departments, and particularly in my own jurisdiction, where the number of departments is now 7. So that means you have a couple of departments that have a lot of ministers associated with them. And while I might have once, and did, in the destructuring of the original human services, say, if you're going to create a single Department of Health, please put all health functions with the Health Minister. In retrospect, I was wrong, and luckily they paid no attention to my view about how the cabinet should be shaped anyhow. And so I think there is a place and time for ministers. If I go back to that central proposition that you either organise government around services or persons or classes, we have across governments now a mixture of both, and generally where there is a minister focused on a class of persons, it is because we have served that class of persons pretty badly. And there is a necessary readjustment to provide focus on that class of persons over time. So even though it would have made life much happier for me if I'd had one minister for all of the health portfolios, it was right to have more than one minister, because the Minister for Health was never going to pay attention to mental health while emergency departments and exciting health dramas were going on.
That goes in part to a point that Debbie raised in her talk about size mattering. It always feels to me that we get obsessed with scale in MOG changes, you know, as somebody who's been in a central agency while those things were being considered. And we do like symmetry in the public sector. Oh, that's looking a bit big. Well, shunt that over there.
Put it over there.
And it always feels to me that actually what matters is coherence of purpose.
Yep.
So no one quibbles about all of the health stuff being in the health cluster because it's obvious, even though that's the largest thing. And so it always feels to me that irrespective of size, if you can't frame a coherent mission for an organisation, or you've got something that's so broad because it's having to accommodate things that are really very disconnected, that perhaps should override the issue of scale, or at least be taken into account. Thoughts?
We've got a very interesting program of work playing out at the moment in the New Zealand context, which, if anybody's read the media about, it's all about housing. So we've got this social housing program, which at one level I think is a really noble thing to do, because in the New Zealand context the social housing policy has remained in the main untouched for sort of 40 years. But of course on top of that we've got rising house prices in Auckland and, you know, a short supply, and so we've got a whole lot of homeless people, and it's playing out in the media every single day. Somebody's, you know, homeless, etc., etc., etc. And what we've got is 3 different ministers across that program. So we've got a social housing minister, we've got a minister for building, and we've got a finance minister who's responsible for Housing New Zealand. And the problem with that is there isn't a coherent story, I don't think, across all of those portfolios that enables people to galvanise around it. And as a result of that, it has made it difficult at the ministerial level, and it has sure as hell made it difficult at the bureaucratic level to be clear about what is priority. At the same time, you've got kind of all the negative media stuff, which is just not helpful. So that's just an example where you haven't got perfect symmetry. You've got a kind of a work program that's a good, fine thing to do, but there isn't the sort of coherence, and there's a sort of media storm which says, you know, now, do. And of course, houses take a little bit of time to build. So, yeah.
That's a perfect example. There are always parts of what governments do that don't have a natural home. So if everything had a natural home, yes, we would have an structure of government and none of us would ever deviate from it, although the organisations would be remarkably boring. But there are bits like housing. Is housing a construction, big project development issue, or is it a social issue? Is TAFE about education, or is it about employment? So there are examples, lots and lots of examples where they move all the time, drives everyone bonkers, but we know they're going to move. They are the same candidates. Where do vulnerable children sit? Should they sit in education? Should they sit with other vulnerable groups? Should they be in justice? Because sadly that's where we're sending most of them in the long run. So that, you know, this idea that there is, but that goes to my point, that where governments choose to allocate those responsibilities is a story of priority. So if you're a government that has a bent that is on about improving the lot of very vulnerable people, you will approach these questions quite differently from one who thinks this is all about building the economic fundamentals of the state, or, you know, doing, you know, I'm a green government, so all I care about is protecting the environment. No government is ever that narrow, but they will have a different bent, and those parts of government are the ones that move. And then there are some that are just odds and sods that don't actually happily sit anywhere. Arts is the reward portfolio. That's the portfolio you give people who've got all the other horrible ones. You know, tourism. It doesn't, or tourism, they don't automatically fit. You can make many choices about where you put them. And that's, you know, that is how governments express themselves, is where they put a lot of this stuff.
I think all of that's right, but we probably should actually state that at the time we're moving something so
Yes.
that we're not forcing people into creating some narrative that they know doesn't really work, because...
Except that I would say at the moment, if I take arts, please, you know, I always wanted the arts portfolio. They put arts into the Department of Economic Development, Jobs, Transport and Resources, and you're all going, really? Why? Because arts is part of the creative, the narrative around this is arts are the creative industry. So it is looking at arts in conjunction with tourism as part of building an experience economy. That Victoria is no longer the manufacturing state. It is going to have to be a state that is quite different. So there is a story there from the government about how they've structured this, what seems like a huge unwieldy department, but has a storyline that goes right across it if you can see it. So it's not always just odds and sods.
No, indeed. Other questions from the floor?
Hi, Russell Bernard. It's probably a question to you, Debbie, in the first instance. So from the New Zealand context. So you talked about vertical accountabilities working generally well. There's creaks and bumps every now and then, and it's the horizontal that we need to talk about. And then you talked about empowering staff to make decisions, particularly across that horizontal area. So I'm interested in the evolving thoughts that you might have on chief executives in the vertical manage and empower their staff within ethical frameworks. Policemen make decisions daily, social workers make decisions, doctors make decisions, all within whatever protocols and policies have been created by that chief executive. When you're sharing across, you've got different ethical frameworks, different operating protocols automatically. Aren't you automatically creating risk for the frontline officer and the chief executive of the agency who manages that staff member, because they may be dealing in environments that they're not familiar with? What's your thought process about managing that at some form of scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think therein lies our challenge, right? But what I think we need to do is we need to work hard at trying to figure all of that out, because you're absolutely right. You will create a whole lot of challenges depending upon what it is that you're trying to work at. But I guess I look at it from the point of view of when I talk about the service delivery vehicles that need to be established, you know, I don't have a view necessarily about what they look like right now, but we do need to figure all of this out. So we need to figure it out both in terms of the ethical challenges, we need to figure it out in terms of the privacy and the information sharing, and we need to think about it in terms of what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So am I saying a policeman should turn a blind eye to something because actually there's a better outcome over there? No, I don't think I'm saying that. What I'm saying though is, if something happens, how do we think about that client and what's going on in their family as to what is the result for them? And how do we use both the incentives and obligations to be able to maximise the benefit of that? So, you know, how do we think about social housing into the future, where you would want a person to be in a social house for the period of time that it is needed, but then they're well supported from a variety of agencies to actually exit that state house? How do we think about young people to stop them entering the youth justice facility or, you know, the system? And what are the decision-making powers that we need to put around some of our frontline people or the vehicles to be able to give effect to that? I guess that's this challenge that I think exists, and we have to keep working at that challenge, because otherwise we just accept what we've always accepted, and we've always said, oh, well, these are wicked problems and, you know, they're really hard to solve and blah, 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 blah. And I'm saying we have to keep pushing through. And what the Minister of Finance, I think, was signalling today was, you know, this sort of notion of data and analytics and how you know where to go to look. It will never tell you what to do, it'll tell you where to look. And trying to get vehicles in my kind of language, to organise around that is what we need to be focused on.
If I can just add to that, because I think that's a fantastic question, and it does get to the heart of some of the issues around restructuring processes, is that we pay not enough attention to the professional structures and values that drive. So my old department, Health and Human Services, they were different planets. We shouldn't be surprised that the frontline workers work the way they do. They are trained to work the way they do. They're not trained to collaborate generally or coordinate, and that's not their specialisation. The current approach to dealing with this, or the current thing that's being tried in dealing with this, which was spoken about in New Zealand, and I've got colleagues doing in Denmark, which is what I'd call much more diagnostically focused, which is you take a person or a family and you diagnose what issues are affecting them and you deal with them in order. You don't try to deal with them all at once because it's too confusing for the family, and B, those workers aren't going to work so well together. And it does kind of get to that hierarchy of need, which it is going to depend on the diagnosis being right about the right needs, but there's some really interesting findings emerging from that about which we do need to build tools. But it will be the endless job of the public service to constantly think about how do we, in the end, we are here to make things better in the lives of citizens. And so how are we best organised to achieve that for them, not, I think as you said, Graham, for our own administrative convenience.
It's actually Debbie.
Oh, sorry, Debbie.
We have to leave it there. It's 3:30. You did very well. Postprandial torpor was overcome by, I think, 2 very good presentations and some lively discussion on machinery of government changes and why they're important and why we have to get better at how they're actually executed. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.